Okay, what is gained and lost when religion consolidates power and influence to institutionalize? So there's two parts of this, which is that part. And then the second one is, how do you personally reckon with the American Christian institution?
This question for me came up when I hit the story of Abraham in Genesis, because so much about that story, Abraham, we can point back to and say he is the founder of faith, and in fact of three faiths, right?
Yeah.
So three separate religions that share kind of a root, but still, we can kind of go back to that. And I think one of the things that was challenging for me as I read through the story of Abraham again and re-encountered that story was that he is a very flawed founder. In fact, I would say from my perspective, I believe he was abusive to the enslaved woman in his house, Hagar. And maybe to his wife too. So there's a challenge there. And for me, I turned to some kind of ancient commentators to try to understand. So I turned to Chrysostom and, some of the early church fathers and the rabbis. And I was trying to understand, how did they make sense of the story of Abraham and Hagar and Sarah when Sarah gave her enslaved woman, her handmaiden, to Abraham to be a surrogate mother for a child. So I was trying to make sense of this passage, which is very hard to understand, and returning to these kind of ancient commentators to say, what did they see in this? Like, what am I missing? And what I found in their text was that they were sort of covering over the sin. It felt like to me, like it sounded sort of like a crisis management team, like at a mega church, where it was like, he wasn't really bad. He never lusted after Hagar. He never forced, this to happen. It was really Sarah's fault, his wife, because she couldn't have children. Maybe if she hadn't been infertile, she was the one who suggested it, by the way. They're kind of going through all this. And I struggled so much with that for lots of reasons, but I thought it's so clear that the Holy Family has done the wrong thing here. So Sarah and Abraham, by not trusting God, they then abused the slave girl and her eventual son, Abraham's son. And it was so clear to me. But I think one of the things I realized is they had this kind of idea in their head of what the institution meant and what the story meant. Like this man had to be a type of Christ. He had to be exactly perfect. Otherwise, maybe it meant that Christ wasn't perfect. And I just saw all those echoes of institution, right? The echoes that say we kind of have to protect the founder, even if he's messed up, and just not tell the truth about what has actually happened. And that's where a lot of the questions about institution came up for me, where I was going, what level of kind of protection, repentance, forgiveness, accountability, all these kind of concepts get all mixed up together when we're talking about institutions and figuring out, what's our relationship to power, really.
Hold on real quick. The way you just brought in Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar was profound. That, and then relating that to institution and sort of this founder syndrome that we can, fall into. Whoa, I've never heard that take before.
I mean, it surprised me, but it stopped me in my tracks, because I got to a point in the writing this book. This was probably halfway through writing this book. And I was like, I don't know if I can keep going, because I cannot stand this man at the center of the story. Abraham, who has abused the enslaved woman in his household. Sarah and Abraham end up throwing Hagar out 2 separate times. The first time she actually runs away, she's pregnant. And that's when God first encounters her, and she gives God the name El Elroy, the God who sees me. The second time, Abraham and Sarah actually throw her out, and she is convinced they're going to die in the desert, her and her son. She like puts her son down under a bush and walks away because she does not want to watch as he dies. And that's when God shows them a well, which in the desert is wealth and safety and power. And they built a society from that because of the gift of God. But I think one of the things that she became a major character in this book because I think it's very easy to push her aside. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things institutions are not good at is allowing a diversity of voices, a diversity of perspectives. You know, institutions thrive when there's one narrative and one leader, preferably a charismatic leader, you know, who's a good fundraiser. And I think, you know, the call that we see in the scriptures is that the healthiest church is a church that embraces every member as having a vital role, right? I struggle to find a way that you can have a healthy institution like that. One that is, you know, equitable, one that prioritizes the relational models. That's very challenging, and it's not very capitalistic. So I think there's challenges there.
There's a lot that you've shared, and I think for some people, they're kind of just triggered. Some people are triggered on the side where you're at, and I kind of am there too, which is that the church is never to side with power.
Yeah,
it's a big deal.
Yeah,
we are not to side with power.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of at the heart of the gospel too. But regardless, on this side is kind of the disenfranchised. And then on this side, there's a different type of disenfranchised, which would be well, you know, and again, I can understand both because I really spend time sitting in the both and, which is, well, I'm a male and I'm not toxic. I don't believe in the machismo. I'm not trying to do anything but lead my home, be the head of my home in the way that Christ is the head of the church and the way I've been called to by Paul. Like, I have the biblical mandate to be this leader. And then for those people to not just tune out when you're talking, now you're talking, I mean, you're talking about Abraham. Like, whoa, come on, man. Like, what? This is not okay. And so people,
I know,
disenfranchised.
Well, first of all, I understand that complexity. You know, I'm white. You know what I mean? Yeah. So that is complex. It just is. And being a white lady, you know, everybody, I feel like, you know, being online, everyone's a second away from calling me a Karen, right? Which is probably reasonable in some cases, right? Well, you know, just in case. That's always in the back of my head though, like wanting to be aware of that. Okay. I would say, so I just relate to both kind of the marginalized groups and these groups in power is what I'm trying to say. And so I think there is a reality there. I mean, there is loss when a group in power realizes that you have too much power, like that what you have is actually not healthy and good for you or for other people. And I mean, as a white lady, I can say that definitively from the perspective of white people, it is not healthy and good for us that white supremacy is the norm. Not to mention for other people, right? So I think the fact is any sort of redistribution of power or voice is always going to feel threatening, but it doesn't mean that it's bad. In fact, I think it's very good. So, I mean, I've been so grateful for the voices of, in particular, BIPOC voices who have been able to really gently tell me the truth about these things, you know, whether it's me personally in an interpersonal relationship or it is online, getting to know people and their generosity and sharing their experiences. I mean, I just think the reality is, if we believe in the sacredness of every human, that God has made every single human in God's image, then that means we actually have to make space. We have to lengthen and widen the table. And there is just no way around it. That is the gospel message, that God sets the table for all of us. So it's a hard word, and I know it. I know it's a hard word. I feel it in my own self. But it doesn't mean that it's not something that should transform the church. And so I think if our institutions do not have space for that, then they are not gospel institutions.
I love it.
Kyle, it's like, you say it, then I don't have to say it.
There we go. No, I think